it's a little dark on this side. Oh, hi! There you all are. Yes, so I have this bonnet. Do you like it? This is good. I have this bonnet, and I have this top, and I have my monkey, and I indeed have Farmer Boy. Yes, we're starting Farmer Boy. I have snacks, but I feel let there be light. Hey, uno momento. Oh, yeah. Hi. Right? It's our very, very high-tech studio. We opened the blinds so you get a little more, yeah, we'll fill. That's so much better. So hi, yes. So here I am again, sitting on the coffee table, hanging in the place here, and adjusting things. Are we all there? Oh, look at that. That's nice. Yes, there we are. So I'll go a little bit here and hi. There you all are. There you are. Ooh, there. Okay, so I have snacks because this is Farmer Boy, which, like I said, it's so all about food. It is so all about food. This is all about how, you know, Laura just didn't have enough food. And, of course, Almanzo did. So I have snacks. So here we are. Today we're reading from Farmer Boy. Starting this is the second book in the series. A lot of people think the second book in the series is Little House on the Prairie, because Little House in the Big Woods. But no, she wrote about her hubby's childhood. Okay, so the very first chapter. Oh my God, this book is huge. Dun, dun, dun. School days. It starts right at the beginning of the year. We like this. It was January in northern New York State, 67 years ago. Well, from the 30s, so there you go. And that's the thing, because Almanzo's from New York. New York! Almanzo's from upper New York State, yay. Snow lay deep everywhere. It loaded the bare limbs of oak and maples and beeches. It bent the green boughs of cedars and spruces down into the drifts. Billows of snow covered the fields and the stone fences. Down a long road through the woods, a little boy trudged to school with his big brother Royal and his two sisters, Eliza Jane and Alice. Royal was 13 years old. Eliza Jane was 12. Alice was 10. Almanzo was the youngest of all, and this was his first going to school because he was not quite 9 years old. He had to walk fast to keep up with the others, and he had to carry the dinner pail. Royal ought to carry it, he said. He's bigger than I be. That's what he said. Royal strode ahead, big and manly in boots, and Eliza Jane said, "No, Manzo, it's your turn to carry it now, because you're the littlest." Eliza Jane was bossy. She always knew what was best to do, and she made Almanzo and Alice do it. Now, does that not sound very much like our Eliza Jane on the show? She was bossy. She was very bossy. It was terrible. I'm like, hi, you're all just coming for a ride with me, because remember the time I was like, hi, it's on the sofa. So, she was very bossy. Poor little things. Almanzo hurried behind Royal, and Alice hurried behind Eliza Jane in the deep paths made by bobsled runners. On each side, the soft snow was piled high. The road went down a long slope. Then it crossed a little bridge and went on for a mile through the frozen woods to the schoolhouse. The cold nipped Almanzo's eyelids and numbed his nose, but inside his good woolen clothes, he was warm. They were all made from the wool of his father's sheep. You see, there you are. This is why they're doing so well, because his family were sheep farmers, and so they had wool, which, like, even then was a good product to have. His underwear was creamy white, but his mother had dyed the wool for his outside clothes. He was literally wearing 100% wool from top to bottom, including, he had on knit wool underwear. Okay, how scratchy did that have to be? How uncomfortable was Almanzo Wilder as a child in his wool suit and his wool drawers. Butternut Hulls had dyed the thread for his coat and his long trousers. Then Mother had woven it, and she had soaked and shrunk the cloth into heavy, thick, full cloth. Not wind nor cold, nor even a drenching rain could go through the good full cloth that his mother made. For Almanzo's waist, she had dyed fine wool as red as a cherry, and she had woven a soft, thin cloth. It was light and warm and beautifully red. His waist is the waistcoat, shirt thing, shirt waist. See, they call it his underwear. He's got a shirt waist and then a coat and pants. This thing, like this would be a jumper. I didn't even know what they would call this back then. Almanzo's long brown pants buttoned to his red waist with a row of bright brass buttons all around his middle. The waist collar buttoned snugly up to his chin, and so did his long coat of brown full cloth. Mother had made his cap of the same brown full cloth, with cozy ear flaps that tied under his chin, and his red mittens were on a string that went up the sleeves of his coat and across the back of his neck. That was so he couldn't lose them. Now, those of us who were California children who didn't have mittens don't really know. The reason the mittens are on a string, it's not just these slingers. You're not like going help with them. No, the mittens, the string goes up all the way around, and is attached. So the mittens are sort of like attached to your sleeves because of the string. It's very smart. We California kids would not know this. We'd be like, why are they on a string? There you are. It's because they talk about his pants. His pants are literally buttoned to his shirt. I mean, he is sealed in to this outfit. It's amazing. He wore one pair of socks pulled snug over the leg of his underdrawers and another pair outside the legs of his long brown pants. And he wore moccasins. They were exactly like the moccasins the Indians wore. So he's got socks over his long johns and then socks up. Okay, he's warm. Girls tied heavy veils over their faces when they went out in winter. But Almanzo was a boy, and his face was out in the frosty air. His cheeks were red as apples, and his nose was redder than a cherry. And after he had walked 1.5 miles, he was glad to see the schoolhouse. It stood lonely in the frozen woods at the foot of Hardscrabble Hill. And that's actually the name, Hardscrabble Hill. It's not just a thing. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and the teacher had shoveled a path through the snowdrifts to the door. 5 big boys were scuffling in the deep snow by the path. Almanzo was frightened when he saw them. Royal pretended not to be afraid, but he was. They were the big boys from Hardscrabble Settlement, and everybody was afraid of them. Hey, is this starting to sound a little like that Bully Boys episode? Okay. They smashed little boys' sleds for fun. They'd catch a little boy and swing him by his legs, then let him go head first into the deep snow. Sometimes they made 2 little boys fight each other, though the little boys didn't want to fight and begged to be let off. These big boys were 16 or 17 years old, and they came to school only in the middle of the winter term. They came to thrash the teacher and break up the school. They boasted that no teacher could finish the winter term in that school, and no teacher ever had. So, they're 16, 17, and probably still in the 3rd grade. But they're awful, and they really just they shouldn't even be going, but they're the kids who worked on the farms and just came to school briefly to make trouble. This year, the teacher was a slim, pale young man. His name was Mr. Course. He was gentle and patient and never whipped little boys because they forgot how to spell a word. Almanzo felt sick inside when he thought how the big boys would beat Mr. Course. Mr. Course wasn't big enough to fight them. There was a hush in the schoolhouse, and you could hear the noise the big boys were making outside. The other pupils stood whispering together by the big stove in the middle of the room. Mr. Course sat at his desk. One thin cheek rested on his slim hand, and he was reading a book. He looked up and said pleasantly, Good morning. They have a nice teacher. There's all these like big terrible teachers whipping children for the most minor infractions, and here is a kindly, slim, slight man who's a teacher who's nice, and here are these horrible people going to come and beat him senseless. So it's bad. Royal and Eliza Jane and Alice answered him politely, but Almanzo did not say anything. He stood by the desk looking at Mr. Corse. Mr. Corse smiled at him and said, "Do you know, I'm going home with you tonight." What? Almanzo was too troubled to answer. "Yes," Mr. Corse said, "it's your father's turn." What? Here. Every family in the district boarded the teacher for 2 weeks. He went from farm to farm till he had stayed 2 weeks at each one. Then he closed school for that term. Okay. I was like, what is he talking about? When he said this, Mr. Corse rapped on his desk with the ruler. It was time for school to begin. All the boys and girls went to their seats. The girls sat on the left side of the room, and the boys sat on the right side, with a big stove and wood box in the middle between them. The big ones sat in the back seats, the middle-sized ones in the middle seats, and the little ones in the front seats. All the seats were the same size. The big boys could hardly get their knees under their desks, and the little boys couldn't rest their feet on the floor. And look, there they are. There they all are. Look how cute is that. There they are, and little tiny children up front. Little tiny schoolhouse. They're like crammed in there. There's like no room. Oh my. Almanzo and Miles Lewis were the primer class. The babies, the kindergarten. Primer class. So they sat on the very front seat, and they had no desk. They had to hold up their primers in their hands. Then Mr. Corse went to the window and tapped on it. The big boys clattered into the entryway, jeering and loudly fighting. They burst to the door open with a big noise, and they swaggered in. Big Bill Ritchie was their leader. He was almost as big as Almanzo's father, and his fists were as big as Almanzo's father's fists. He stamped the snow from his feet and noisily tramped to a back seat. The 4 other boys made all the noise they could, too. Mr. Corse did not say anything. No whispering was permitted in school, and no fidgeting. Everyone must be perfectly still and keep his eyes fixed on his lesson. Almanzo and Miles held up their primers and tried not to swing their legs. They can't touch the floor. They were like too small. Trying not to swing their legs. Their legs grew so tired that they ached, dangling from the edge of the seat. Sometimes one leg would kick suddenly before Almanzo could stop it. Restless leg syndrome. Oh my. Then he tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but he could feel Mr. Corse looking at him. In the back seats, the big boys whispered and scuffled and slammed their books. Mr. Corse said sternly, "A little less disturbance, please." That was it. That's all he did. It's like very calm. Very cool. For a minute, they were quiet. Then they began again. They wanted Mr. Corse to try to punish them. When he did, all 5 of them would jump on him. Awful. At last, the primer class was called, and Almanzo could slide off of the seat and walk with Miles to the teacher's desk. Mr. Corse took Almanzo's primer and gave them words to spell. When Royal had been in the primer class, he had often come home at night with his hand stiff and swollen. The teacher had beaten his palm with a ruler because Royal did not know his lesson. Ow! The beatings again in this thing. Ow, ow. And then Father said, "If the teacher has to thrash you again, Royal, I'll give you a thrashing you'll remember." Violence everywhere. Just violence everywhere here. But Mr. Corse never beat a little boy's hand with his ruler. He was very modern. He was cool. Mr. Corse did not beat these kids. When Almanzo could not spell a word, Mr. Corse said, "Stay in at recess and learn it." He's practically Miss Beadle. He's so cool. Okay. At recess, the girls were let out first. They put on their hoods and their cloaks and quietly went outdoors. After 15 minutes, Mr. Corse rapped on the window, and they came in, hung their wraps in the entry, and took their books again. Then the boys could go out for 15 minutes. Now, this is even more severe than at the time of Little House when we saw it like in Walnut Grove on the show. Boys and girls didn't even have recess together. You know, on our show, we had the boys and girls were sitting together in their little seats, like boy, girl, and stuff. They were mixed, and they played together, and that was like modern, because in many schools, girls sat on one side, boys sat on the other, and they had separate recesses. They're strict. The boys, they rushed out shouting into the cold. The first out began snowballing the others. All that had sleds scrambled up Hardscrabble Hill. They flung themselves stomach down on their sleds and swooped down the long steep slope. They upset into the snow, and they ran and wrestled and threw snowballs and washed one another's faces with snow. And all the time they yelled as loud as they could. They sound like idiots. Just yeah. And they're rubbing the snow in each other's faces. The boys sound really just like rough and hyper and kind of awful. I would be glad to have separate boy-girl recesses with these people. Yes, we're having a little Diet Coke today. Washing their faces with snow. Ugh. So when Almanzo had to stay in his seat at recess, he was ashamed because he was kept in with the girls. At noontime, everyone was allowed to move about the schoolroom and talk quietly. Eliza Jane opened the dinner pail on her desk. It held bread and butter sausage, donuts and apples, and 4 delicious apple turnovers, their plump crusts filled with melting slices of apple and spicy brown juice. After Almanzo had eaten every crumb of his turnover and licked his fingers, he took a drink of water from the pail with a dipper in it from a bench in the corner. Then he put on his cap and coat and mittens and went out to play. The sun was shining almost overhead. All the snow was a dazzle of sparkles, and the wood haulers were coming down Hardscrabble Hill. High on the bobsleds piled with logs, the men cracked their whips and shouted to their horses, and the horses shook jingles from their string of bells. All the boys ran shouting to fasten their sleds to the bobsled's runners, and boys who had not brought their sleds climbed up and rode on the loads of wood. Oh, that's not dangerous at all. This is like so dangerous. They took little sleds. It's a huge, huge runner full of lumber. It is a lumber truck. It's a lumber truck on sleds. And they're like, hey, I'll just attach. This is like taking your skateboard out and tying it to the back of an enormous lumber truck on the freeway. This is essentially what these people have just done. This is terrible, terrible. They went merrily past the schoolhouse and down the road before getting killed. Snowballs were flying thick. Up on the loads, the boys wrestled, pushing each other off into the deep drifts. Almanzo and Miles rode shouting on Miles' sled. It did not seem a minute since they left the schoolhouse, but it took much longer to go back. First they walked, then they trotted, then they ran, panting. They were afraid they'd be late. Then they knew they were late. Mr. Corse would whip them all. The schoolhouse stood silent. They did not want to go in, but they had to. They stole in quietly. Mr. Corse sat at his desk, and all the girls were in their places, pretending to study. On the boys' side of the room, every seat was empty. They were all late. Almanzo crept to his seat in the dreadful silence. He held up his primer and tried not to breathe so loud. Mr. Corse did not say anything. Bill, Richie, and the other big boys didn't care. They made all the noise they could going to their seats. Mr. Corse waited until they were quiet. Then he said, I will overlook your tardiness this one time, but do not let it happen again. Everybody knew the big boys would be tardy again. Mr. Corse could not punish them because they could thrash him, and that was what they meant to do. Awful! Awful, awful, awful. More of these violent, thuggish people in the 1800s. It is. Now, I'm good. That was one chapter, but clearly, I need to read more. Because it's the next one is Winter Evening. So, this is chapter 2, Winter Evening. I'll do that, but, I have to go slow, because Manly himself, Dean Butler, is going to eventually start reading this thing, like Monday. So, I gotta leave him something good. But we're going to do chapter 2, okay? After I eat my crunchy cheddar goldfish. The air was still as ice. Oh, that's good. Salt! And the twigs were snapping in the cold. A gray light came from the snow, but shadows were gathering in the woods. It was dusk when Almanzo trudged up the last long slope to the farmhouse. He hurried behind Royal, who hurried behind Mr. Corse. Because remember, teacher's coming with him. Alice walked fast behind Eliza Jane and the other sled track. They kept their mouths covered from the cold, and they did not say anything. The roof of the tall, red-painted house was rounded with snow, and from all the eaves hung a fringe of great icicles. The front of the house was dark, but a sled track went to the big barns, and a path had been shoveled to the side door, and candlelight shone in the kitchen windows. Almanzo did not go into the house. He gave the dinner pail to Alice, and he went to the barns with Roy. There were 3 long, enormous barns. 3 barns! Okay, see, Laura and her family had that little, barn made of sticks. And Almanzo's got this, 3 barns, industrial size farm going on. So, yeah. 3 barns around 3 sides of the square barnyard. Altogether, they were the finest barns in all that country. He had the best barns in all of Oleson. Almanzo was first into the horse barn. It faced the house, and it was 100 feet long. The horses' row of box stalls was in the middle. At one end was the calf shed, and beyond it the snug hen house, and the other end was the buggy house. It was so large that 2 buggies and the sleigh could be driven into it with plenty of room to unhitch the horses. The horses went from it into their stalls without going out again into the cold. They had a 3-car garage. They had the 1800s version of a 3-car garage. So this is why Laura wrote about this, because her family didn't even have a buggy, let alone a barn to stick it in. And here he's got a 3-buggy garage. So, yeah. The big barn began at the west end of the horse barn and made the west side of the barnyard. In the big barn's middle was the big barn floor. Now, this is all capitalized, by the way. Big barn floor, so you know. It's a specific big barn floor. It's a title. Great doors opened onto it from the meadows to let loaded hay wagons in. On one side was the great hay bay, 50 feet long and 20 feet wide, crammed full of hay to the peak of the roof far overhead. Beyond the big barn floor were 14 stalls for the cows and oxen. Beyond them was the machine shed, and beyond it was the tool shed. There you turned the corner into the south barn. Okay, you could fit 30 of Laura's entire house into this place. In it was the feed room, and then the hog pens, and then the calf pens, then the south barn floor. That was the threshing floor. It was even larger than the big barn floor, and the fanning mill stood there. The fanning, because sure, he has a fanning mill. I don't know what a fanning mill is. I bet someone knows what a fanning mill is. I bet in the comments someone's going, yes, of course, the fanning mill. Because they know all their stuff here. Beyond the south barn floor was a shed for the young cattle, and beyond it was the sheepfold. That was all of the south barn. So we've had cows and sheep and hogs and chickens and a 3-car garage. That's awesome. A tight board fence, 12 feet high, stood along the east side of the barnyard. The 3 huge barns and the fence walled in the snug yard. Winds howled and snow beat against them, but could not get in. No matter how stormy the winter, there was hardly ever more than 2 feet of snow in the sheltered barnyard. When Almanzo went into these great barns, he always went through the horse barn's little door. He loved horses. There they stood in their roomy box stalls, clean and sleek and gleaming brown, with long black manes and tails. The wise, sedate workhorses placidly munched hay. The 3-year-olds put their noses together across the bars. They seemed to whisper together. Then softly their nostrils whooshed along one another's necks. One pretended to bite, and they squealed and whirled and kicked in play. The old horses turned their backs and looked like grandmothers at the young ones. But the colts ran about excited on their gangling legs and stared and wondered. They all knew Almanzo. Their ears pricked up and their eyes shone softly when they saw him. The 3-year-olds came eagerly and thrust their heads out to nuzzle at him. Their noses, prickled with a few stiff hairs, were soft as velvet, and on their foreheads the short, fine hair was silky smooth. Their necks arched proudly, firm and round, and the black manes fell over them like a heavy fringe. You could run your hand along these firm, curved necks in the warmth under the mane. Oh, doesn't it just makes you love horses? Do you love horses? I am not a horsey person, which did make it slightly difficult to be a little house on the prairie for 7 years, where there was horses like all the time. It was a little hard for me because I'm not a horsey girl. I know everyone's like the beautiful horse and they want to pet the horses and ride the horses. I was like, yeah, you stay over there. I socially distanced from the horses. Believe me, I was 6 feet away from the horses. But Almanzo loves his horses. But Almanzo hardly dared to do it. He was not allowed to touch the beautiful 3-year-olds. He could not go into their stalls, not even to clean them. He was only 8 years old, and Father would not let him handle the young horses or the colts. Father didn't trust him yet, because colts and young, unbroken horses are very easily spoiled. Did you know that? A boy who didn't know any better might scare a young horse or tease it, even strike it, and that would ruin it. It would learn to bite and kick and hate people, and then it would never be a good horse. Now, his father's right, because little boys might not know better, and they might scare the horse, and then this horse that you're breeding to be a great racer, yeah, then what? You can't have children frightening the horses. Almanzo did know better. He wouldn't ever scare or hurt one of those beautiful colts. He would always be quiet and gentle and patient. He wouldn't startle a colt or shout at it, not even if it stepped on his foot. But Father wouldn't believe this. Well, we all know from the show and from the books that Almanzo is a beautiful, sweet, gentle person. But, what, his pa, he didn't, So Almanzo could only look longingly at the eager 3-year-olds. He just touched their velvety noses, and then he went quickly away from them and put on his barn frock over his good school clothes. Barn frock. Is that a new band name? Barn frock. Okay, good. Father had already watered all the stock. He was beginning to give them their grain. Royal and Almanzo took pitchforks and went from stall to stall, cleaning out the soiled hay underfoot and spreading fresh hay from the mangers to make clean beds for the cows and the oxen and the calves and the sheep. They did not have to make beds for the hogs, because hogs make their own beds and keep them clean. Well, I guess as clean as hogs do. In the south barn, Almanzo's own 2 little calves were in one stall. They came crowding each other at the bars when they saw him. Both calves were red, and one had a white spot on his forehead. Almanzo had named him Star. Oh, the other was bright red all over, and Almanzo called him Bright. It's so cute. Star and Bright. Oh, it's so cute. Were young calves, not yet a year old. Their little horns had only begun to grow hard in the soft hair by their ears. Almanzo scratched around their little horns because calves like that. Like cats, like kitties, scratch behind your ears. And calves, they want to be scratched behind the ears. They pushed their moist, blunt noses between the bars and licked with their rough tongues. Almanzo took 2 carrots from the cow's feed box and snapped little pieces off them and fed the pieces one by one to Star and Bright. Then he took up his pitchfork again and climbed into the hay mows overhead. It was dark there. Only a little light came from the pierced tin sides of the lantern hung in the alleyway below. Royal and Almanzo were not allowed to take a lantern into the haymows, for fear of fire, but in a moment they could see in the dusk. No, you don't let 8-year-olds run around with a flaming lantern in the barn, because we did that on Little House on the Prairie, and Mary burned down a barn, and Albert burned down a blind school. And see, that's why, because in real life, they're a lot more careful. But these kids playing with fire. They worked fast, pitching hay into the mangers below. Almanzo could hear the crunching of all the animals eating. The haymows were warm with the warmth of all the stock below, and the hay smelled dusty sweet. There was a smell, too, of the horses and cows, and a woolly smell of sheep. Ew. And before the boys finished filling the mangers, there was the good smell of warm milk foaming into Father's milk pail. Almanzo took his own little milking stool and a pail and sat down in Blossom's stall to milk her. His hands were not yet strong enough to milk a hard milker, but he could milk Blossom and Bossy. I love cow names. Do you love cow names? Because they're named things like Suki and Bossy and Blossom. I like cow names. So he could only milk the really mellow Bossy Blossom cows. They were good old cows who gave down their milk easily and hardly ever switched a stinging tail into his eyes or upset the pail with a hind foot. He sat with the pail between his feet and milked steadily. Left, right, swish, swish, the streams of milk slanted into the pail, while the cows licked up their grain and crunched their carrots. The barn cats curved their bodies against the corners of the stall, loudly purring. They were sleek and fat from eating mice. Every barn cat had large ears and a long tail, sure signs of a good mouser. Day and night they patrolled the barns, keeping mice and rats from the feed bins, and at milking time they lapped up pans of warm milk. When Almanzo had finished milking, he filled the pans for the cats. Cats get milk. His father went into Blossom's stall with his own pail and stool and sat down to strip the last, richest drops of milk from Blossom's udder. But Almanzo had got it all. Then Father went into Bossy's stall. He came out at once and said, "You're a good milker, son." Almanzo just turned around and kicked at the straw on the floor. He was too pleased to say anything. Now he could milk cows by himself. Father needn't strip them after him. Pretty soon he would be milking the hardest milkers. Almanzo's father had pleasant blue eyes that twinkled. He was a big man, with a long, soft brown beard and soft brown hair. His frock of brown wool hung to the tops of his tall boots. The two fronts of it were crossed on his broad chest and belted snug around his waist. This is your barn frock. It's like a huge, instead of overalls, they had literally a smock, a giant, hazmat coat to go in the barn. So it's all belted snug around his waist. Then the shirt of it hung down over his trousers of good brown fullcloth. Father was an important man. He had a good farm. He drove the best horses in that country. His word was as good as his bond, and every year he put money in the bank. The Ingalls, I don't think they even ever went to a bank. They had a little box with some coins in it on the mantle. They didn't have any cash. They had a bank. These people had a bank. They had to go to the bank with their money. They could write checks. So yes, the Wilders were much better off. Money in the bank. When Father drove into Malone, all the townspeople spoke to him respectfully. Royal came up with his milk pail and lantern. He said in a low voice, "Father, Big Bill Ritchie came to school today." The holes in the tin lantern freckled everything with little lights and shadows. Almanzo could see that Father looked solemn. He stroked his beard and slowly shook his head. Almanzo waited anxiously, but Father only took the lantern and made a last round of the barns to see that everything was snug for the night. Then they went into the house. But he was thinking. was thinking. The cold stars were cruel. The night was black and still, and the stars were tiny sparkles in the sky. Almanzo was glad to get into the big kitchen, warm with fire and candlelight. He was very hungry. Soft water from the rain barrel was warming on the stove. First Father, then Royal, then Almanzo took his turn at the wash basin on the bench by the door. They washed their hands, didn't they? Almanzo wiped on the linen roller towel, then standing before the little mirror on the wall, he parted his wet hair and combed it smoothly down. They all washed their hands. The kitchen was full of hoop skirts, balancing and swirling. Eliza, Jane, and Alice were hurrying to dish up supper. Hoop skirts, because it's like way back. The salty brown smell of frying ham made Almanzo's stomach gnaw inside him. He stopped just a minute in the pantry door. Mother was straining the milk at the far end of the long pantry. Her back was toward him. The shelves on both sides were loaded with good things to eat. Big yellow cheeses were stacked there, and large brown cakes of maple sugar, and there were crusty loaves of fresh baked bread, and 4 large cakes, and one whole shelf full of pies. A shelf of pies. One of the pies was cut, and a little piece of crust was temptingly broken off. It would never be missed. Almanzo hadn't even moved yet, but Eliza Jane cried out, "Almanzo, you stop that! Mother!" Busted. Mother didn't turn around. She said, "Leave that be, Almanzo. You'll spoil your supper." That was so senseless that it made Almanzo mad. One little bite couldn't spoil a supper. He was starving, and they wouldn't let him eat anything until they had put it on the table. Unfair. There wasn't any sense in it, but of course he could not say this to Mother. He had to obey her without a word. He stuck out his tongue at Eliza Jane. She couldn't do anything. Her hands were full. Then he went quickly into the dining room. The lamplight was dazzling. By the square heating stove set into the wall, Father was talking politics. Politics to Mr. Corse. Father's face was toward the supper table, and Almanzo dared not touch anything on it. Okay, here we go. This is the food orgy of Almanzo story, Farm Boy. There were slabs of tempting cheese. There was a plate of quivering head cheese. There were glass dishes of jams and jellies and preserves, and a tall pitcher of milk, and a steaming pan of baked beans with crisp bits of fat pork in the crumbling brown crust. Almanzo looked at them all, and something twisted in his middle. He swallowed and went slowly away. The dining room was pretty. There were green stripes and rows of tiny red flowers on the chocolate brown wallpaper, and Mother had woven the rag carpet to match. She had dyed the rags green and chocolate brown and woven them in stripes with a tiny stripe of red and white rags twisted together between them. The tall corner cupboards were full of fascinating things, seashells and petrified wood and curious rocks and books. These people had books in their house. Seashells. Somebody they were in New York, they went to the ocean. Laura hadn't even seen the ocean at the time that Almanzo had seashells just sitting in his dining room. And over the center table hung an air castle. What? Alice had made it of clean yellow wheat straws, set together airily with bits of bright-colored cloth at the corners. It swayed and quivered in the slightest breath of air, and the lamplight ran gleaming along the golden straws. So an air castle's a little woven straw sculpture thingy that you hang and it floats around. It's pretty. But to Almanzo, the most beautiful sight was his mother, bringing in the big willow-ware platter full of sizzling ham. Mother was short and plump and pretty. Her eyes were blue, and her brown hair was like a bird's smooth wings. A row of little red buttons ran down the front of her dress of wine-colored wool, from her flat white linen collar to the white apron tied around her waist. Her big sleeves hung like large red bells at either end of the blue platter. She came through the doorway with a little pause and a tug, because her hoop skirts were wider than the door. He got stuck in the door with her hip skirts and her platter of ham. Hang on a minute. Okay, there, good. The smell of the ham was almost more than Almanzo could bear. Mother set the platter on the table. She looked to see that everything was ready and the table properly set. She took off her apron and hung it in the kitchen. She waited until Father had finished what he was saying to Mr. Corse, but at last she said, "James, supper is ready." It seemed a long time before they were all in their places. Father sat at the head of the table, Mother at the foot. Then they must all bow their heads while Father asked God to bless the food. After that, there was a little pause before Father unfolded his napkin and tucked it in at the neckband of his frock. He began to fill the plates. First he filled Mr. Corse's plate, then Mother's, then Royal's, then Eliza Jane's and Alice's. Then at last he filled Almanzo's plate. "Thank you," Almanzo said. Those were the only words he was allowed to speak at the table. Children must be seen and not heard. Father and Mother and Mr. Corse could talk, but Royal and Eliza Jane and Alice and Almanzo must not say a word. Here we go. Almanzo ate the sweet, mellow baked beans. He ate the bit of salt pork that melted like cream in his mouth. He ate mealy boiled potatoes with brown ham gravy. He ate the ham. He bit deep into velvety bread spread with sleek butter, and he ate the crisp golden crust. I am not making this up. This seriously is what he demolished a tall heap of pale mashed turnips and a hill of stewed yellow pumpkin. Then he sighed and tucked his napkin deeper into the neckband of his red waist. And he ate plum preserves and strawberry jam and grape jelly and spiced watermelon rind pickles. He felt very comfortable inside. Slowly, he ate a large piece of pumpkin pie. I don't have any pumpkin pie, but I have apple pie. I did not make this like Alonzo's mom, but I have pie. And, yes, I'm going to I'm sorry, there's no way that I can read this and not shove a big hunk of pie in my mouth. You can't read this chapter and not eat pie. I should have made a pumpkin one. Pie! He heard Father say to Mr. Corse, "The Hardscrabble boys came to school today, Royal tells me." "Yes," Mr. Corse said. "I hear they're saying they'll throw you out." Mr. Corse said, "I guess they'll be trying it." Father blew on the tea in his saucer. He tasted it, then drained the saucer and poured a little more tea into it. He drinks his tea out of his saucer. "They have driven out 2 teachers," he said. "Last year, they hurt Jonas Lane so bad he died of it later." "I know," Mr. Corse said. "Jonas Lane and I went to school together. He was my friend." Father did not say any more. That is literally, it ends there. That is the end of the chapter. It's getting dark and scary. Okay, so tomorrow we will go into winter night. There will be more pie and handfuls of popcorn and milk and cider and more pie. But yes, things have gotten weird because, as he said, not only are these boys threatening poor Mr. Corse, as Almanzo's father said, they threatened a guy the year before and they killed him. They killed him. He died of his injuries. Now, in this century, that's manslaughter and it's liability, and there would be lawsuits and charges filed if he died from injuries. I don't know. I don't know what they did then. I don't know if they just said, "Darn, the local toughs beat up a teacher and he didn't make it," and they just went with that, or what were their repercussions? Did they go into Malone, into town, and call the sheriff? Were the boys charged with anything? Were their families run out of town? Doesn't say. It just says that the local boys beat up the last teacher and beat him so badly he died of his injuries. And then they like ate more pie and just went on. So that's kind of terrifying. So luckily though, it sounds like Almanzo's dad is watching out for Mr. Course. He's asking a lot of questions, stroking his beard, nodding. He's thinking of something. So we can help. But it's getting good, it's scary, and there is more. And then there's more apples and pie and harvest and sheep shearing and Lord knows what else. But like I said, I'm going to go slow. Maybe I'll do one chapter tomorrow because Manly, Dean Butler, has to like read the rest. I gotta make him read the rest. So tomorrow's Saturday. I don't know, I might go a little later. Yeah, we'll go for 1:30. We'll go for 1:30 again. It'll be cool. And I will be here with snacks and another bonnet. And hey, most of the bonnet orders, like all the bonnet orders, like 10, 11, they went out. They're gone, like Monday. You should start receiving bits and pieces. Things should start arriving Monday or Tuesday at your homes if you ordered something from the store. So there you go. And I have more bonnets on the way to me so that I have anything to send you after that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for hanging out with me here. And I'm going to eat the rest of this pie. And yay! And wash your hands and be nice to each other. And I'll see you tomorrow. Okay.